Everybody, today is going to be very first episode of the new DCU DCQ podcast. I am Peter Lawlor. I'm going to be the host. Very good host, very great host. Thank you. And I'm joined today with Eleanor Williams. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Appreciate it greatly. You being here and all as such. Today we're going to be discussing politicalization. Big word like marmalade. Politicalization of terrorist groups in Colombia and Northern Ireland and such. And so, thank you, Dr. Williams, for, joining us here today. I appreciate it greatly. Would you like to say a few words yourself?
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be on one of the first episodes of the podcasts, and yeah, look forward to untangling this big topic with you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Could you, Dr. Williams, tell us, what is politicalization?
So, in the terrorist context, it's how armed groups, so whether it's the IRA or the FARC in Colombian or Hezbollah, how they kind of go from being an armed faction. So sometimes these groups are actually actual armies, but sometimes they're more kind of guerrilla warfare tactics, but how they move from those tactics to being in the political sphere. So whether then they join elections and try to be part of whether Congress, Parliament, in their own kind of specific countries and how that kind of transition to political means. And sometimes they completely give up the armed wing of their group, or sometimes they do both in kind of tandem, and then slowly go to the political wing then. So it's that process of taking an armed kind of group and persuading them to take a more political, peaceful road.
When you have an example of, say, the Taliban almost, they're like a bit of a unique example of themselves because they are an Islamic group, but and they have regained control in Afghanistan and such. They are basically a government there, but they're still classified as a terrorist group. So how would you say that really affects things? Is that like a really unique example? It's popped into my head.
No, the Taliban case is a really interesting one because people say you should always, well, people like Jonathan Powell now, so Ch Tony Blair's ex-chief of staff, he'll always say you should always talk to terrorists. There's always something to gain. And the problem with the Taliban agreement was that the US said, we'll leave. They gave a date for withdrawal. Now, one thing the British never did in Northern Ireland, they never said that they would withdraw on a specific date out of Northern Ireland. So they wouldn't take the British Army completely out of Northern Ireland. So there wasn't a day that the IRA could wait and go, okay, well, on 31st of October 1999, they can't come back. And then the IRA could then just take over completely. So it's the art of negotiation with these groups that's really key. So there was a flaw in the negotiation with the Taliban that then once the US were out, then that that kind of it wasn't a successful agreement. So how these negotiations are kind of how they take place and who is part of them and who advises these leaders is really, really key. Because yeah, it can go wrong. And the Taliban case is a good example of kind of where it wasn't in well, the US is didn't go right for the US, definitely.
Yeah, and you mentioned how like, these governments, they like the US, they negotiate with the Taliban probably under the table sort of sneaky little deals and such. And that was probably done by like the CIA or FBI or something. And same thing with MI5 with, the IOA and such and such. So I'm just wondering now, what role did like intelligence services, do in like helping politicalization of these terrorist groups, What would
That's
you?
a really, really good question. And I think when we think of intelligence groups, we've got to take it away from your James Bond, but also you've got to take it away from these groups being one kind of happy family. Actually, they're kind of very individualistic with their own cultures, with their own ideas. So I'll go back to the Northern Ireland case that you had different factions, whether it was MI5, MI6, the special branch of the police service, you had the intelligence of the military, you had the SAS, and they all had a different idea of what, number one, whether they could kind of militarily beat the IRA, and also what a successful kind of what success even looked like. So for many within the army, they wanted to kind of quash any single part of the IRA. Whereas many kind of in MI5, etc., thought, right, hang on, you're never, for as long as there's one person claiming to be in the IRA, you're never going to defeat the IRA. And it only takes another kind of generation for this to come up. That actually you need to have a peace process. You need to take away the reasons why people are fighting. So going back to your point then, kind of what role did intelligence services have? They had a number of roles. They had a role in maybe kind of prolonging the conflict, perhaps, with putting kind of counterproductive agents in some places, but also then behind the scenes, you had diplomats in the Northern Ireland office, from Dublin, kind of all behind the scenes, kind of creating confidence building measures with people on the Republican side, but also the Loyalist side, and trying to come to an agreement from 1985 onwards. So it was a long process of gaining kind of small little deals and confidence building with the other side continuously. And yeah, intelligence of different kind of players would have had a role in this, but
Yeah.
also they would have had the opposite role as well. Everyone
It's
happy.
almost better when neither side is winning because then, they think, oh, the government's going to be like, oh, we're winning, we won't negotiate with terrorists, or the terrorists are winning, we're winning, we won't negotiate with the government. But if neither side's winning, they sort of have to come together and say, right, let's get something down, let's put the hammer in the nail or something. That's
Yeah.
fair enough. Yeah.
No, definitely. And that's the same with the case in Colombia, for example. You hit kind of 2008 and both sides where the FARC isn't kind of controlling a third of the country anymore, but also the government realized without the help of the United States that they're never going to defeat the FARC, so the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia either. So it's in their kind of both interest for kind of resources and kind of to get some kind of actual outcomes out of this is to talk to each other. But also, like you mentioned, like both sides are suffering, but usually in all of this, it is the civilians that suffer the most. People that just want to get on with their ordinary lives are usually caught in the crossfire economically, but also kind of in the horrific kind of death tolls in most of these conflicts.
Yeah, there's people always be suffering, but on that point, when you say that people suffer and such, isn't it the goal of these like terrorist organizations to gain favor with the people? Like Robin Hood's like, oh, we're fighting against the government. So, if the terrorist organizations are trying to gain popularity, get people on my side and support me, then why would they be targeting civilians? Ain't that like shooting yourself in the head or foot or something? Bombing your own
Yeah,
car?
and that's a really good point. And I think a lot of groups, a lot of these, and I put in inverted commas, successful groups realize this. And especially when they go through the kind of politicization process, they realize, hang on, we need the support, so we can't be attacking our own people. And a lot, so for example, then in Northern Ireland, you had by the early 1990s this kind of England campaign. So when you had Gerry Adams having an MP seat, etc., it's not good to then be bombing the people of West Belfast. So actually, they shift number one from civilian targets to economic targets, and also they shift location, and also they're trying to get the attention of the British government who are based in London. So bombing London is probably going to get their attention much more than bombing the streets of Enniskillen or London.
That's fair enough to know. I suppose they hit them with the wallets. They hit them where
Yeah,
it hurts in the money.
definitely,
Like,
definitely. And that
I'll
happened
bring me
again
to
in
the
Colombia.
table.
Sorry.
Hmm. Oh yeah, no, sorry, I was about to mention like, the FARC, they control the third of the country, as you said, but they didn't get much of anywhere. Did they start bombing the banks or something before the government got to the table? Well, what did they do? That was so
Yeah,
successful.
they shifted again from kind of civilian targets to economic targets, so bombing pipelines and etc. There's Colombia's a vast country, it's full of mountains, and you fly a lot in Colombia rather than drive. But they started kind of targeting infrastructure. So yeah, your oil pipelines, your water pipelines, and that really kind of got the government's attention, where people in kind of the rural areas were not kind of connected, etc. That really kind of shifts how the country's run. And rather than, unfortunately, a few kind of 100 people dying every year, which again is horrific, but yeah, arguably it gets the government's attention more when it's infrastructure being attacked.
You know, what exactly do we learn from this? Learn from these like the Colombia with the FARC and then the IOA in Northern Ireland, apart from bomb the banks and such. What do we learn to like prevent these things, or just like if they do happen, bring about a bit of peace. Give me a bit of peace and quiet.
Well, I think, and that's a good question. What can we learn from all this? I think talking is always good. Um, and this is good for also the government side. You will always gain understanding. A lot of these conflict situations begin because both sides are polarized. They have no understanding of each other, and they have no patience with each other, and they come from very, very different cultures. Whereas the more these sides can talk to each other, whether they completely disagree with each other, they'll start to think, well, that's what they're going to think. They're going to understand what they're thinking, the perspective that they're coming from, and what they believe. Whether they actually agree with what they believe in is completely different, but start to understand their truths. And by even just doing that and understanding them, you'll understand how to negotiate with them. You'll understand what their bottom line is. And slowly you'll begin to kind of gain trust and these kind of confidence building measures. And even, for example, in Colombia, you had so many attempts at peace, but by kind of, what was it, 2016 at the end, you had 30, 40 years of mutual, like the FARC secretariat hadn't changed that much, but they'd negotiated with about, I think, six different governments. So they had a very intricate understanding of the Colombian government, how they operated, who they needed to talk to, and who they needed to kind of cut out of an agreement and be more suspicious of. And again, this is the same in Northern Ireland, that people that were in the part of the Republican group, so Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams, were in the 1972 talks with the British government. So by the time it came to 1998 with Tony Blair, they're like, hang on then, we know your tricks, we know how you work,
Yeah.
we know what your bottom line is, and also
The
kind of,
terrorists have an advantage, basically.
well, they're usually in these positions for longer than the governments. But this is why, and a bit of my recent research is civil servants, because similar to the terrorists in these organizations, the civil servants in these governments are also about for a very long time. So they're really interesting because they get to know these individuals quite well, kind of in back channel, behind the scenes stuff. So yeah, under the table stuff, like you said before. So you've got these kind of two actors in the civil service and the governments and in the terrorist groups, kind of this longevity of continuance, and they really understand each other by the time. So even though it's quite sad and obviously for civilians that these people die because of the longevity of these conflicts, but usually the longer people talk and come to an agreement, they learn how to agree but also disagree, and that usually makes the actual peace process itself post agreement then more successful because all these different sides know how to actually talk to each other, work together, and then eventually govern together post agreement, hopefully.
That's fair enough then, certainly important lessons, I suppose. Although I did think of one thing though when you were saying that you said about like, allowing them to talk and such and legalizing these parties. But what if these parties, one of these people who are talking, they're pushing things like what's the term? Like, how we live in a democratic society. And in these democratic societies we talk. That's what you say is helps these peace processes go ahead, both sides talking. But what if, one side, like say terrorists or something, what if they don't like democracy? What if what they're speaking is against like the very system that allows them to speak, so to speak, what's the solution then?
Yeah, this is interesting because this is what happened, well, I suppose in Northern Ireland and Colombia. So those are the two cases that I'm most familiar with, that the Republican movement didn't believe in Westminster. So they would run to be an MP, member of Parliament, but they wouldn't sit. And that's really interesting. And the fact they were kind of completely against how the Colombian state operated. They were completely a
They were like
Marxist group.
socialists or Marxists or something, weren't they?
Yeah, completely Marxist. So it is interesting. And I think that's where they have to come halfway with these groups, that they're going to have to, and this is the big step in politicization. So there's many kind of hawks and doves within terrorist groups. And many of the hawks will kind of argue, well, we don't even agree with the state. So why would we politicize? So why would we even engage in it? Because we don't recognize that state. So that's kind of the big, you're definitely right that there is a tension there. And that's the big debate within kind of these armed groups. And then there's others, kind of the devs then are saying, well, hang on, we have to talk, we have to arrive at the table to talk to these people. If we don't even agree that the table's there, then we're never going to talk to them or come to an agreement. So you're definitely right, there is a tension. And it usually takes these armed groups a long, well, not a long time, but a bit of time to realize this, and for some of the devs to prevail, and yeah, hopefully politicize a bit.
Fair enough then. And just one other thing, it's just you mentioned how these terrorists, because their leadership doesn't tend to change, and therefore they're very experienced against the tricks of the other government. And because the government is constantly changing because of elections and such, that's almost like a weakness almost when they're negotiating with these groups, with these terrorist groups. But wouldn't that be would you say then that almost more autocratic or authoritarian governments would have a benefit in, debate in negotiating or even dealing with terrorists because of the lack of change in governments? You know?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I not thought of that. I think the political power that the people have, so whether it's Prime Minister, Taoiseach, President, their position is really important. So I'll use the British example again, sorry.
It's
But
fine. Try and go ahead, use whatever example you want.
early 90s, you got John Major. Now, in my opinion, a very underrated, many people don't even know who John Major is, but a very underrated British Prime Minister. But he has not got a very strong position in Parliament. He's not got a majority. The rebels are rebelling, and those who are keeping him in power, so the UUP in Northern Ireland, are not liking what he's doing in Northern Ireland. So he cannot do much. And he knows that a general election's coming up soon, that he knows whatever he's going to put in, he won't be there post 97 to see it through. Tony Blair comes in, nice, brand spanking new, bushy-tailed, fresh-faced, comes in, massive majority, has confidence, and he knows he can kind of do what he wants politically in Northern Ireland because no, he's got a massive majority. There's no unionist parties keeping him in. So not authoritarian, but he knows that he has got kind of a nice buffer to keep him safe. And he knows probably got enough majority to keep him in for 2 terms, unless something nuts goes happens, such as an Iraq war. But there we go. But he knew likelihood is he's going to be in for 8 years. Very different to John Major. So yeah, you're completely right. The position they have, and what's particularly interesting in Colombia actually, is before. So you had Uribe come in, quite a famous president. I think he came in 2002. Doesn't matter. He came in about 2002, and he before him it was only 1 term per president. So any president that came in only had 4 years. There's only so much you can do in 4 years to try and bring peace to a massive conflict of nearly kind of, well, 40 years. Whereas then Uribe comes in, he's very anti-peace, but he does change the constitution to have 2 terms. He has 8 years. That's a big change in Colombia. And then when you have Santos come in then in 2012, I believe, or
Yeah, whatever
2008.
day he came in. He came
Yes,
in and
he came in, he had enough buffer. He had a massive majority. And also, you knew, right, I don't need a 4 year plan, I need an 8 year plan. Because likelihood is I'll get re-elected, which he did. And yeah, so you have much more kind of flexibility and power. Because trying to do so much in 4 years, as well as govern the country, is quite a lot. So yeah, that change, again, not quite authoritarian, but it does mean just a bit more longevity does actually, yeah, carry weight. You're definitely right, Peter.
oh, so yeah, basically, yeah, like you said, longevity does help quite a bit, but it's not longevity isn't just an authoritarian thing. Democratic societies can also give their leaders a bit of longevity, a bit of sprucing the step and such, a bit more rope. That's fair enough. Then I'll sure tell you what, though. Tell you what, I think. One thing I did want to say though, you mentioned it throughout about like the impact on civilians and such, and a lot of these terrorist groups, you mentioned Islamists and such, they're more religious. The FARC, they were mainly popular in the rural forests and countryside, that sort of thing. So I'm just wondering, the politicalization process, what impact does that have on like civilians? We know terrorists, they bomb civilians, but what impact does making these terrorists more more normally political have on the common man? Does it like heal the cultural or religious divisions, that might have caused these terrorist groups to show up in the first place? Just
That's a really good question, and it reminds me of a really interesting anecdote. And forgive me again for going back to my Northern Ireland case study, but during the 90s, it was a really interesting initiative by the Prime Minister's office, um, the Prime Minister Cabinet Office, where it was called Good News Northern Ireland. And this was a bit of an undercover loosely undercover initiative where the more the peace process happened, the more that the Republican movement and the Loyalist movement, so the Unionist, kind of hard Unionist, PUP, for example, the more they politicised as well, that more good news would happen to Northern Ireland. So people would relate politicisation, good news for Northern Ireland. So things like IKEA coming, the opening of another Marks and Spencer's. These really kind of trivial things, but actually the people kind of correlated it with success of the peace process. For example, you've got people like Robbie Williams and Elton John, Mo Mowlam, the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland. You've got documents of her kind of, right, we've got to contact Elton John, tell him it's for peace in Northern Ireland, because we've got to have people on board. If we have peace, we've got Elton. So it's these big things, and again, people will know the Bono U2 concert with John Hume coming out and the success of all that. But actually, that's what people cared about. People cared that these big celebs are going to come because they weren't scared that their concert was going to be bombed, or actually they could get a flat pack for a really cheap price. So that's actually just normality. People wanted normal things, and slowly that's what kind of they got. And yeah, it was actually interestingly part of the kind of British government's plan to people to be convinced of a peace process because they had normal things.
Oh, fair enough. So next time there's like a terrorist organization, we just phone up Drake and say, "Yo, Drake, get over here. We need your help. You're gonna stop the terror." Next
In
time a
my
bomb goes off, just call him.
Yeah, I mean, Beyonce is always the answer.
Hmm. I mean, it is interesting. Like it's almost like a cycle or a self-fulfilling prophecy, The more the terrorists, be peaceful, the more good things happen, the more good things happen, the more people like it. The more the people who are sort of supporting these terrorists in a way are pushing them to become more political, in which case more good things happen and yada yada yada, so on and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. And the electorate definitely has an important role in holding these people to accountable. I think it was in 1992 that Gerry Adams lost his seat actually because the IRA hadn't politicized enough. And that was a big message actually that the SDLP member got in instead in that area in West Belfast. And actually that was a big message. People like Thomas Leahy will argue this. This actually was a big message to Sinn Féin, like, well, hang on, put your money where your mouth is and politicize more, or we'll elect other people in who are serious about peace. So yeah, it is interesting that actually ordinary people do have power in these positions, even though they might feel powerless.
That's fair enough. Then I mean, hey, power to the people. It's good to know that, even when all the bombs and bullets are going off and flying everywhere, the people, at the end of the day, we're the masters of what happened. We can change things. And so, honestly, Dr. Williams, thank you so much for coming on here and talking to us about the politicalization of terrorist parties. Hopefully, next time we can talk about something with a more simpler word to pronounce, you know. But apart from that, honestly, thank you so much, Doctor. And hopefully, people lessons learned here, it can go on and inspire more peace. More peace. Everyone loves peace. I love peace. You love peace. Everyone does. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Williams, and God bless and have a lovely day. And thank you for everyone who's listening to DCQ. God bless.
Thank you for having me. Look forward to seeing where the podcast goes.